welcoming Professor Michael Byers.
Thank you, Steve. It's wonderful to be here, particularly at a time when one can actually speak somewhat optimistically about the prospects for global disarmament. The times are changing. I'm very pleased to see Franklin Griffiths in the room, because I'm going to refer to Frank on a couple of occasions. And the first is right now. Frank has warned about purveyors of polar peril. And there are, as our colleague from Stanford pointed out this morning, purveyors of polar peril and proponents of greater tension between Russia and NATO who reside in Moscow. And there are similar people who reside in the United States, and yes, indeed, in this country as well. And we have to take their warnings of prospects for conflict with a large grain of salt. The news in the Arctic is mostly good news when it comes to cooperation, and in particular relations with Russia. And it's bad news with respect to climate change. And to a much lesser but still relevant degree, it's bad news with respect to threats from non-state actors. But the Cold War has been over for several decades now. And Russia, in the Arctic at least, has been playing a mostly constructive role. Best example I can give of this is that Russia, together with the United States, Canada, Denmark, and Norway, the Arctic Ocean coastal states, in May of 2008 signed the Ilulissat Declaration, whereby Russia and those other countries, again including the United States, committed to working within the framework of international law, most notably the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, to peacefully determine who had sovereign rights over which areas of Arctic Ocean seabed, and to ensure that any overlapping claims were resolved according to the rule of law. I'm pleased to report as well that the legal advisors from those 5 countries' foreign ministries met in September, and a proposal was on the table and remains on the table for those countries to submit coordinated claims to the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Of course, Russia not only has its own purveyors of polar peril, Russia also has its domestic politics. And so, yes, the deputy chair of the Russian Duma did lead an expedition in the summer of 2007 to plant a titanium Russian flag on the floor of the Arctic Ocean at the North Pole. The Russian foreign minister later admitted that it was purely a publicity stunt and that the deputy speaker did not have the permission of the Kremlin. But there was a Russian election underway. Incidentally, the North Pole is on the high seas, and there was nothing illegal about the Russian action, even if it was mildly provocative, or from the perspective of then Canadian Foreign Minister Peter MacKay, highly provocative, but that then gets into issues of Canadian politics in terms of his reaction. A lot of good news when it comes to cooperation in the Arctic. And yes, there can be more. When the idea of a comprehensive Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone was brought to my attention a couple of years ago, I was pretty skeptical. Skeptical for a number of reasons, including the fact that the Russian Northern Fleet is based north of the Arctic Circle in Murmansk, and that nuclear-armed submarines from Russia, the United States, and quite possibly France and the United Kingdom regularly are deployed in the Arctic Ocean. Indeed, the Arctic Ocean was a very important front line in the Cold War. And one might actually think that the Arctic Ocean is the last place on Earth where we will see the removal of nuclear weapons. But of course, the removal of nuclear weapons from everywhere on Earth is now on the table. And so think about that for a second. If we get global nuclear disarmament, we will get our Arctic nuclear weapons free zone by definition. And what we're talking about is whether we can accelerate that global process by pushing the Arctic zone a little bit ahead of that ultimate goal. There is other good news. The Arctic is, in some significant respects, already subject to nuclear weapon-free zones or equivalent declarations of one kind or another. Think of the 1971 Seabed Treaty, which means that by agreement, no country can locate nuclear weapons on the floor of the Arctic Ocean. Very important. We have that already. So there's a partial nuclear weapons-free zone for the entire Arctic Ocean dating back to 1971. We have subnational governments that have declared their territory to be nuclear weapon-free zones. The Yukon Territory is a self-declared nuclear weapon-free zone. So too is the Northwest Territories. And that declaration was made while Nunavut was still part of the NWT. So at the level of territorial governments, 40% of this country constitutes self-declared nuclear weapon-free zones. Now, unfortunately, those declarations have no impact at the level of international law and very limited impact in terms of international relations, but there's certainly something that we should highlight, and we should encourage those territorial governments to renew those declarations and seek to persuade Nunavut as the new majority Inuit governed territory of 1/5 of Canada's landmass to do that in particular. My own sense is that the government of Nunavut might be quite receptive to this, because the Inuit, through the then Inuit Circumpolar Conference, now renamed the Inuit Circumpolar Council, have twice declared their desire to have all of their traditional territory free from nuclear arms. In 1977 and 1981, and let me just read you part of their declaration from 1981, and this is the Inuit organization that represents the Inuit from Canada, Alaska, Greenland, and part of Russia. And their position is that the Arctic should be used for purposes that are peaceful and environmentally safe, that there shall be no nuclear testing or nuclear devices in the Arctic or subarctic, that there shall be no nuclear dump sites in the Arctic or subarctic, and some people will be particularly interested in this, that exploration, exploitation of uranium, thorium, lithium, or other materials related to the nuclear industry in our homeland be prohibited. Now, the Inuit Circumpolar Council is not a nation state, but it does have permanent participant status at the Arctic Council, and it has played a very important role in some aspects of international lawmaking, perhaps most notably in the development and adoption of the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, where without the leadership of Sheila Watt-Cloutier, my children and grandchildren would be destined to have much higher levels of PCBs in their bodies than will now be the case. The Inuit have been instrumental there, and also obviously very important in raising public consciousness in the South, in the non-Arctic regions, about the extreme impact of climate change. And I agree entirely with Mike Wallace that we need to pursue other opportunities for continuing this momentum and continuing the reach of of non-nuclearization of the Arctic. As Adele said, it's obvious we should be working with the Inuit because they've been here before. And one proposal that I think needs to be highlighted was made by Franklin Griffith in 1979. And Frank, you will remember that you proposed that it be agreed through treaty that the surface of the Arctic Ocean, the surface of the water and the sea ice, be explicitly non-militarized. Not a particularly radical proposition because the surface is non-militarized. The Canadian Navy, for instance, does not operate in the Arctic at this moment. Only the Canadian Coast Guard, a civilian agency. Most of the governmental activity on the part of other countries is done by equivalent Coast Guard type agencies rather than the military. Even China, in terms of its presence in the Arctic, well, it's through a Chinese research icebreaker, the Snow Dragon, and not a naval vessel. We're talking here about the surface of the water, not the subsurface, not the submarines. But what an opportune moment to close off any increased militarization of the Arctic through surface navies, and actually to promote an agreement that would essentially freeze the situation where it is now, and then provide the verification and necessary backup to create the confidence among all of the Arctic countries that they didn't need to spend money on Arctic offshore patrol ships and other naval vessels, that there was agreement that the Arctic should continue to be primarily a civilian domain, one of cooperation. And so, Frank, I have dusted off that paper from 3 decades ago, and perhaps you and I might work together to put this proposal into the current dynamic that's been created by Barack Obama and also by the rapidly melting sea ice. I also agree that we want to start with the Arctic states that are, in terms of a nuclear weapons-free zone specifically, that are already free of nuclear weapons. We don't want to have a pretend Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone, a treaty that looks really good on a headline of a newspaper, but if you read the actual provisions, doesn't amount to much. A lot is made, for instance, of some of the Southern Hemisphere treaties, but if you take, for instance, the Rarotonga Treaty and look at it closely, you'll find that it not only allows transits of nuclear weapons through that nuclear weapons-free zone, but it also allows for the launching of nuclear weapons from that zone. The only thing it really prohibits is the targeting of locations within the zone with nuclear weapons, to my mind, that doesn't really amount to all that much. So if we're working towards an Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone, let's not enter into a pretend zone. Let's do incremental steps that actually mean something. And excluding, at least initially, the United States and Russia from any such zone in that context makes an awful lot of sense. We will, when we get to the stage of talking with Denmark and with the self-government of Greenland, encounter the issue of Thule. I'm not sure whether nuclear weapons are currently deployed at Thule, but the problem there will be similar to that of Diego Garcia, the British-owned island in the Indian Ocean, which is the location of a major American base, which has caused real problems in terms of the Palindaba Treaty, the African nuclear weapons free zone. And the existence of Diego Garcia within that zone has meant that neither the United States or Russia have been able to accept that treaty for different reasons. Thule will be a sticking point. But the sticking point may actually come more in terms of problems between the government of Greenland, which represents Greenlanders who were forcibly excluded from Thule to have the base built, and the government of Denmark. And I'm looking at Steve here because the Greenlanders were very opposed to to missile defense and Danish participation and the siting of a new radar facility at Thule, and they were overridden by the Danish government. But since last year, as a result of a national referendum, the Greenlanders have much more extensive powers of self-governance, so watch that space. In terms of what Mike said about the NATO strategic concept, that will cause problems for the non-nuclear weapon states in the Arctic, but perhaps the time is ripe with the Obama administration and all of the development there to either modify that concept, provide exemptions that might allow for an Arctic nuclear-free zone, or perhaps simply to ignore those constraints and push forward in the spirit of what would you call that, entrepreneurship that wasn't bound or constrained by technical rules. And the same approach is one that I would like to suggest might be most appropriate in terms of the Northwest Passage. If Nunavut were to declare itself a nuclear weapons-free zone, or even better, if the government of Canada were to declare all of Canada a nuclear weapons-free zone, something I've advocated for a couple of years now, and I know others have been doing so for much longer, that would create an opportunity to provoke the dispute with the United States over the Northwest Passage, because if we have a nuclear weapons-free zone and we maintain our position that the Northwest Passage constitutes internal waters, then by implication, no nuclear weapons can pass through. And if we were to press the point with the United States, well, they would then come back to us with the sticking point of nuclear submarine traffics, and we would simply exacerbate that existing dispute. I've written elsewhere about ways in which we could promote cooperation and confidence building with the Americans over the Northwest Passage with a view to the eventual resolution of our legal differences. But if we're going to do an Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone, whether merely for Nunavut or for all of Canada, or one that included other Arctic countries, I think the best strategy would be to simply treat any possible submarine transits as things we can't know about, because of course they are covert, and therefore we will press ahead with our nuclear weapons-free zone, but we will at the same time not insist on waving the red flag in front of the American bull. And that would be a continuation of decades of practice between our two countries, where we have, on most aspects of the Northwest Passage, simply and for the most part quietly agreed to disagree. So in conclusion, there's a lot of good news when it comes to the Arctic. There are the elements of an Arctic nuclear weapons-free zone already in place. There are territorial governments that have been pressing forward. The major indigenous organization has been on this issue for 3 decades now. There are fantastic proposals like that made by Franklin Griffith in 1979 that have acquired new relevance, and I'm optimistic that a great deal could be done. But I will close by saying that much of this could only be done if we had governments in this country that were willing to do so. And perhaps it will be for the government of Nunavut or for other levels of government in this country to take the lead on this. But the time is certainly ripe. The Americans are in a more progressive position on these issues than they have been for many decades. The Russians are cooperating. The only thing that, from my perspective, is missing is that traditional progressive middle power, which I call my own. Thank you.